Hi guys, Piggy Bank Recaps here. Today I will recap movie called Howl. Spoiler alert. Watch out and take care. At the beginning of the movie we are introduced to a man named Joe. He is a train attendant who has just finished with his job. Joe starts packing up to get back home, and there Joe receives a letter that he failed to be promoted as a supervisor because the position has been replaced by his co-worker named David. On that night David also immediately told him to go back to work, and he also gave the task to guard the train that was going to depart last, even though Joe had just finished his work. At first Joe had refused, but because Joe was threatened to be fired, he had no other choice. Until finally he began his work again. The only encouragement in his work was the presence of Ellen. In the carriage Ellen worked as a waiter who delivered food. That night, their train began to drive and began to enter the deserted forest area, and in the forest it was very difficult to get a signal. Hours before arriving at the last station, their train nearly derailed after it hit a deer stuck in the wheel of the train. At that time Joe tried to calm the passengers in it, while the driver also tried to pull the deer stuck in the wheel, but suddenly from the direction of the forest the machinist heard a voice and saw something moving. And finally the machinist becomes the victim of a werewolf. The atmosphere on the train began to become gripping. In addition to the team that would help them could not come because the train tracks were blocked by fallen trees, and it seemed to be the work of the werewolf. At that time all the passengers of the train began to become worried, and they also began to urge Joe to allow them to walk to the nearest station. Joe initially refuses, but because there is no other choice, they all start getting off the train together. The journey was eventually led by Joe, and he also told the passengers to stay in line and not scattered. But not far from there Joe and Ellen instead found the body of the machinist, who looked very bad. Until finally Joe told all the passengers of the train to immediately re-enter the train. But unfortunately the werewolf was right behind them, and finally one of the passengers' legs was bitten by a human wolf. Seeing the incident, the atmosphere in the car became increasingly gripping. Then Joe and some other passengers began to discuss to find a way out that they could take. But suddenly the train door was pushed back from the outside, and luckily the train door was still able to protect them. Then they all began to move, but when one of the female passengers picked up the phone it started ringing. Suddenly the werewolf managed to break the window glass and pull the woman out. Shortly afterwards, fresh blood began pouring from the train window, accompanied by a rumbling sound from above. Because of the incident, now the few remaining passengers begin to decide to lock themselves in another carriage, and they all also begin to close all the windows and doors to prevent the werewolf from entering the house. In addition, it turns out that the condition of a female passenger who was bitten by a werewolf begins to deteriorate. She begins to vomit blood, and her teeth also begin to come off. At that time they remembered that there was another passenger who was in the toilet, because Joe immediately checked it, but unfortunately a man had already been approached by a werewolf and immediately dragged out through the toilet glass. After that Joe returned to meet the other passengers, but the train door was damaged by werewolves who went straight into the train corridor and began attacking the passengers one by one. At that time they were all trying to fight him, until finally they managed to kill the werewolf. Then after that Joe starts to see the body of the werewolf, and he finds a ring that is wrapped in his sweet. This indicates that werewolves were also the same living creatures as them. They all begin to think that the werewolf was exposed to a virus or some sort of gene mutation due to a bite. And instantly they all immediately set their sights on one of the female passengers who had been bitten by a werewolf earlier. Then all of a sudden, the werewolf that had been killed came back to life and immediately howled. Joe, who was there, immediately returned to kill him. But it turns out that the howling has called for another herd of werewolves to approach the train, as well as the female passenger who was bitten earlier, who at that time began to act strangely like a wolf. Seeing this, the other male passenger immediately tried to kill him. However, his efforts were stopped by Joe. After that, Joe asked the other passengers to tie the two people up. Meanwhile, Joe and some of the other passengers attempt to repair the train. They all began to divide their respective tasks. Then two other men get the task of repairing the fuel line, but suddenly one of the men hears a voice for help from the direction of the forest. Because of this, a man begins to enter the forest, and here a man finds another female passenger being eaten alive by a werewolf. Seeing that, a man tried to escape, but his efforts were in vain, because some other werewolves had surrounded him. In addition, the damaged train has been successfully repaired, but at that time a man who repaired the machine had to hide at the bottom of the machine to avoid the attack of werewolves. On the other hand, a female passenger is seen who begins to be attacked by a herd of werewolves. But at that time one of the male passengers does not help her and instead pushes her out of the. Meanwhile, a man under the engine also tried to restrain his body, but he accidentally pulled out one of the fuel lines so that the train stopped again. On the other hand, a woman who was affected by the bite had also completely turned into a werewolf, and she immediately preyed on other passengers who were nearby. Seeing this, a man who was in the same room became frightened. But luckily Joe came and immediately killed the werewolf with a stick that pierced his chest. But at that time Joe even had a fight with a man because it had caused the other passengers to be killed. Then suddenly, the werewolf herd begins to enter the train, and a man Joe has helped instead attacks Joe and traps him by closing the door of the train. Then a man jumped out of the train. Luckily, another passenger was trying to help Joe and Ellen who were trapped. But unfortunately his good intentions actually get him killed, while Joe and Ellen managed to escape towards the forest. The werewolf continues to pursue them, and Joe asks Ellen to leave him immediately, as Joe will try to deter the werewolf. With a heavy heart, Ellen was forced to leave Joe. And Joe is also directly attacked by the herd of werewolves. Joe tries his best against them to distract himself from Ellen, but unfortunately Joe has to become a victim. After a long escape, Ellen finally made it to the nearest station by holding an ID belonging to Joe. At the end of the film we'll see a man who set Joe up, and he's trying to find a way out of the woods. Then he saw Joe's uniform lying on the ground, and he also began to be reunited with Joe. But by then Joe had turned into a werewolf with a very sharp fang in his mouth. And at that time Joe immediately attacked him and the movie ended.